Hi everyone. Please subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, so definitely from an astrological vantage point, you could see this coming in some measure. What I mean by that is that I first noticed this quite a while back because you can look ahead in an ephemeris to see where planets are going. I knew there was a zone where Mars would travel through the squares to his Uranus, Sun, Moon from Virgo. But in fact, when I noticed it even earlier this month, prior to the Epstein situation blowing up, I didn't know that would be the factor or the theme. And this is because astrology, in a sense, is an unbelievably accurate map in describing to you where the zones are, or for example, in, let's say, military terms, since we're talking about a Mars cycle here being very important, it's like knowing where the mines are, and then it's up to you not to step on them. Although sometimes it can be really hard to do that, especially the more mines there are, the worse it's going to be. But you don't necessarily know the nature of the mine, or what it actually signifies in terms of the theme. That's the problem. Either way, though, as we moved into the roughly middle point of the month, Mars gets activated, and currently the Mars is still mostly involved in his first planet, the Uranus position, and this is explosive in terms of response, Uranus being an extremely rebellious energy, which this man incarnates constantly anyway. The Mars agitates it, so then what he decides to do is, in the midst of his intense irritation about the fact that this won't go away and that his supporters insist on wanting answers, he gives them the middle finger, which obviously is not a good idea. This is where, if you track your own astrology, then when Mars is there, you can explore your own anger and your own irritability and your own impulse control. And the whole task is to get better and better at that, because it's not helpful. It's not helpful in your private life, and it's not helpful, probably even worse, in political life, because you can do damage you may not recover from. And so he's in this swath of time, which spans from roughly a little before the middle of the month, but it continues now. Mars is yet to reach his Moon square and then his Sun square. And this happens between now and the end of the month. Looking at where the Mars is going, my sense is that it'll be near month's end when the theme starts to change for him, because number one, the Mars moves beyond the last point. It gets far enough in Virgo, say near the 26th degree or so, 25, 26, to get away from where his Sun is, to lower the temperature. And simultaneously, the Jupiter cycle, which I remember saying quite a few times would be a lot more difficult for him to navigate than it had been the case when it was in Gemini, his own sign, which has the quality of letting you get away with a lot of things. Jupiter that way can be very forgiving. But once you put Jupiter in a zone where it's making squares and in a house like the 12th, not the same thing, a lot more complicated. And then it's also how the person channels it. And this guy is notorious for drifting to the downside of Jupiter, which is, if you think about it, it's the primary archetype of expansion. So when expansion runs amok, you get overconfidence, you get arrogance. You get what he's doing here. He's behaving in an arrogant way. I know best, just shut up and do what I say. Well, this is probably not going to work at the moment. And so Jupiter right now is complicating matters for him because his arrogance is also being stoked. But I noticed that at month's end, it will finally start to leave those really tricky degrees in Cancer, in the cardinal sign of Cancer, which are for him between roughly 4 or 5 degrees and 10, 11 degrees, which is where it is now. It's right in the heart of that, so it's really stimulating it, but then it gets beyond. So then both the heat and the anger of Mars downtrend some, or possibly even a lot, although for him, for separate reasons, he has that Mars rising next to the ascendant, which means he's perpetually in that combative mode. But that's more on the level of character. And even if it's all-encompassing and it's there most of the time, it's when Mars itself in transit triggers the situation that it can really get complicated. So then those two taper down some. But the problem he has is that there's a respite of maybe, if he's lucky, it could be as much as 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks of August. And I'm suspecting probably maybe even a little less than that. But let's just say a couple of weeks. But then the second half of August, what happens then is that Jupiter is getting deeper into Cancer by then. And so then it starts to make, well, at least one pretty major square to his own natal Jupiter, which sits at 17 degrees Libra. And simultaneously, Mars by then has entered Libra. And in entering Libra, when it reaches the 4 or 5 degree range, it's doing the same thing that Jupiter has been doing in July, meaning it triggers that infamous axis Hollywood T-square of his, which means, again, stoking up problems and, again, connecting him to his irritation, his combativeness. And so that gives you another zone when things are not going so well. And it's not just that. I mean, his problem is that when I use the analogy of a minefield, the problem is that so many other planets, like Pluto is in an irritating position because it's doing its thing from Aquarius and irritating planets in its chart, like the Uranus position, it's irritating that. Eris, which is sitting there like a dead major rock, because Eris moves really slowly, has a glacial movement. So what happens as a result is that for years and years, every roughly midsummer, and then the other time that it does this is in January, around mid-month. It goes, I think at the time of the insurrection, it was in a little earlier, dipping down a bit, but basically mid-January and midsummer, that Eris is very strong in pretty much the same degrees, and it's doing a persistent direct square to his Venus-Saturn conjunction. So that planet is another major problem. And this topic happens to be very connected to the theme that he's dealing with, meaning these sordid secrets, that have been in the background, and now he's refusing to release the information and so forth. The other thing too that's very symbolic and very obvious in the astrology is that if you look at the Mars square that is happening right now, it happens to planets in Gemini and Sagittarius, his moon, and then the Sun Uranus, and those are in his 511 axis in his chart. And the 511 axis, among quite a number of things, on the fifth side of the fifth, that's love affairs, and this has immediately some connection to that, especially because the moon also rules the 12th, so it links it that way. But the other two, even more glaringly, the Gemini planets, that's his 11th sign, and that's the house of groups and associations. I've often thought that this guy is he's like a mob leader. If you think of the 11th is like the mob, the group that you've built that follows you, that works with you. And what he's doing now is he's attacking them, which to me seems like a really terrible idea, but that's how this can work. And even though he's almost 79 years old, and you would think life experience would have taught him by now that this can never be a good plan. You have to control those impulses, and you have to rein in the anger. And we know that these people, I mean, it's pretty obvious that whether it's Trump or we heard this about Biden, probably was also true of Obama, in the background they might be cursing and behaving in ways that are completely different than their more polished public profile. But bottom line, it's never a good idea to approach it in this way. And so it's simply not working at the moment for him. But then if you think, what about in the future months? There's plenty there. Like I said earlier, there's mine after mine after mine, because right now, it's amazing that the Saturn-Neptune positions are really not doing that much astrologically to bother him by precise degrees, but they come back to do that later in the year. So there's plenty of time for things to continue along the same lines, or even get worse or much worse. Now, I'll end though with one thing, a caveat, to explain this in as complete a way as possible, which is that people will hear me say these things, and then they'll say, yeah, but okay, just tell me when he's going to go down. I don't know that. I know where the mines are. He can step out of mine at any moment, because I didn't even bring up that in the midst of all this, I've said repeatedly, his health situation isn't good. There are a lot of planets in there that are pressing, and hence, for example, we heard today someone took a picture of his hand and it looks a little strange. Something's going on there. You also see quite a few times where he sounds pretty incoherent. And there you'd say, well, when? At some point. I mean, there's lots and lots of times the rest of this year, 2026 and 2027. He's in it constantly. And so in that sense, it could happen at any time, particularly when you know that, not to throw too much astrology all at once, but the Uranus cycle, which is famous for sudden lightning, bolt activity, unexpected, shocking stuff, that Uranus isn't finished with his Mars ascendant in the late degrees of Taurus. So between now and next late spring, it's roaming around and it'll come back to those degrees. And so that can be enough for a huge unexpected event which could affect his health. But astrology being what it is, it might turn out to be a different way that it'll express itself, but typically that's not going to be positive at all, right? And finally, from the vantage point of thinking, okay, there's this Epstein thing and that's it, it's guaranteed to take him down. I'm not sure. I think it's just yet another topic that sets him back and starts to create more and more rifts, which are important from the vantage point of reducing his power. So, for example, I have a suspicion that the way what they'll probably do to buy themselves some time, even though at best it'll just delay something that is sure to show up later at some point, but they'll probably say, well, we're going to appoint a special counsel to investigate it, and if you know what he's like. I mean, you already know this man's nature. He's not going to pick a special counsel that is going to look for actual things. It would be a special counsel like when they were doing the Durham report, that whole bit of nonsense. This guy spends years, and then when they go to court, they had this flimsy case that went nowhere, and it was dismissed immediately because there was nothing there. In this case, there's a lot there. So he's going to want someone who will find a way to basically make it go away, sweep it under the rug. That's not that easy, though, because here they're being hoisted on their own petard. They played with something that, it's pretty dangerous. You lead people along, and I think he misjudged the level of commitment these people have to their conspiracies, to things they think are true, but are at best only partly true, if at all. Many times they're completely invented. Doesn't matter, that's what he did. He spent years on social media. Not only was he doing it when he was president, in between, he kept posting and reposting people's conspiracies, QAnon stuff, all of that. The wackier it was, the better, in the belief that he would get those people to vote for him and to attract even more people with that mindset. But now it's coming back to haunt him. And indeed, the on one level of the conspiracy, you could say point to the 12th house for that as well. Fits neatly in that house. So many of the maladies fit in that house, but the more pure way that it's showing up from the vantage point of the 12th is the sordid sexuality, the criminality, the trafficking, all that stuff is most explicitly connected there.